Ungodly.
I'm live.
So some of you are familiar with him. Andy Pargadon. He did his undergraduate degrees at Stanford in mechanical engineering and a PhD there also in engineering and management. At Stanford, he worked for a few years for Apple as a design engineer. And based upon all that, he wrote a book called How Breakthroughs Happen, which is really a nice read if you're interested in innovation and technology. Highly recommended. Came to UC Davis, and he's been here. He's a professor in the Graduate School of Management, CSM. He's director of the Child Family. Okay, I got to read this one. The Child Family Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And he's going to be, Andy does innovation. And so he's going to be talking about that today. He also was actually the first chair of our Energy Efficiency Center, the first director of it. And at lunch, we just kind of getting you ready for it, getting us ready for it. Susan and I and a few others were talking to Andy and talking about innovation. We covered everything from how to change the university to have tenure for teachers versus researchers, to innovation in urban policy, all the way to search engines and so on. So Andy's got a fountain of experience and knowledge, really relevant. And I bring that up because actually Susan and I were talking that we, for a lot of our students here in transportation, we're always struggling with what's the theoretical foundation or the methodological foundation. And in many ways, innovation, and I'll say innovation theory for the partly to inspire Andy's talk, innovation methods, innovation theory, innovation frameworks are so critical to most of what we all do. So this talk is, I mean, if you think about it, so Andy's going to be talking about creating more of a theoretical framework for how to think about innovation. And so even if it might seem a little remote, it's so relevant to all of us. So Andy, thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, Dan. So let me begin by obviously thanking Dan. And it's been a pleasure to work with Dan. Dan's been sort of a, I don't know if mentor is the right word, but exactly. But in terms of putting together the Energy Efficiency Center, and then anything I've done since then has sort of been based on watching how Dan did stuff like ITS, so and these programs here. So it's been fun to work with Dan in that. I am, as he said, going to talk about theory. I'm getting some feedback here, and I'm not sure what's. What I wanted to talk about was particularly the theories of innovation and how to think about those. I took the notion that this was a research seminar seriously, meaning I'm actually directing this mostly at how we do research and to talk about how we do research. And I'll use my own research as an example of that, but the ideas, and apologies to senior faculty who probably have already. But then that's the goal of my talk. As Dan mentioned, talking about theory, what is theory? Theory is a means to explain a phenomenon, and I think that's in many ways how innovation gets used here, and is one of the reasons why I was motivated to give this particular talk. that I've worked with a number of students in technology, transportation policy, and ITS over the years. Innovation for you right there. Over the years, what I've seen is, and oftentimes you guys are in the middle of trying to understand and predict phenomena, and innovation happens to be a box of theories that you need to run off and grab one and come back and see if it works, and then if it doesn't, go back and get another one, see if it works, without a whole lot of focus on it. And it's very different from the disciplinary approach that I took, which was I was trained in organizational behavior and management and theories of organizations, one of which is sort of a heavy focus and reliance on innovation theory. And that meant that really a lot of my work was, in fact, building innovation theory rather than using the theory necessarily to explain a phenomenon. What I did, in fact, often was grounded theory, which was using the theory to begin to look at a particular event that was going on and then coming back and trying to figure out where in the theory there were weaknesses that I could strengthen based on what I found. And then I'll come up in my talk. But what I want to talk about now is how to think about these theories of innovation and how to use them in your own work, whether that's research or policy-driven work. It really started with some work that I was asked to do on behalf of Pew for the Center on Climate Change. And they wanted to understand low-carbon innovation and what was it that the companies were doing to be successful in driving low-carbon innovations into the marketplace. And after a long discussion with them, we realized, what they initially wanted me to do was rewrite your ordinary manuscript on management of innovation for low-carbon innovation markets. And everything from 15% time, free time for your employees to work on things, to 5-star cafeterias, to all of the brainstorming and all of the traditional best practices we associate with innovation, and just rewrite it for low carbon innovation. And I, obviously I balked at that one, and then proceeded to look for about a year and a half at these cases and realized that there were some significant differences in what made companies effective at driving low carbon innovation that weren't captured not just in the existing literature, but in the original sort of research theories of innovation. And that's what I want to talk about today. So the way I'm going to do that now is to provide you a little bit of context. We drifted at our lunch. I'm going to drift even further for a moment. Let me give you what is an important theory that everybody should know, everybody who's building theory should know. And it was best expressed in a study done by two guys, Darley and Batson, in 1973 called the Good Samaritan Study. And if you're all familiar, I'm not sure how many people are you familiar with the Good Samaritan parable. The Good Samaritan parable is a story of how a Jew is traveling the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and it's a particularly dangerous road. He is beaten and robbed and left for dead on the side of the road. And that is the beginning of the story. And after that, as Jesus tells the story, a priest walks by and fears that if he stops to help, he'll be robbed. So he hurries past this guy. Then a Levite, which is sort of a political version of a priest, comes by. And he, again, fears that this guy might be pretending to be hurt, and he's actually a robber. So he walks by. And then a Samaritan, who happened to be of a particular tribe that is, in fact, was sort of at odds with the Jews, stops and helps. And he gives him his money, gives him his clothes, and he comes back afterwards and makes sure he's okay, takes him to an inn to be cared for. And the story is one of how the good qualities in us who love thy neighbor to help out those of us, those we meet who are in need of help. And it's a story about inherent qualities we have as people. Are we helpful? Are we kind? Are we considerate? And it was this story that then inspired a study called the Good Samaritan Study, which was a study to look at whether or not people are inherently good, or that's a terribly value-laden term, but let's just say, do people have inherent traits that if we're psychologists, we can rely on, we can identify, and then we can use that basic assumption that these traits are inherent to predict people's behavior in other settings. So that was the notion. Do people have inherent traits that are fixed across all settings? And so they ran this study where they actually went to a seminary and they created an experimental situation in which seminary students were asked to conduct an experiment in one building. And the experiment was, write about the work of being a seminary student, or write about the meaning and value of being dedicating yourself to religion. Then they were told they had to get to another building to complete the second experiment, and they divided the group into 3 categories. Some people, they said, it's a 10-minute walk, but don't worry, that is not for 15 minutes, so you can just take your time and head on over there. Another group, they said, it's a 10-minute walk, and you're just going to make it if you start now, so you better go. Another group, they said, it's going to take you about 10 minutes to get there, but it starts in about 5 minutes, so you're really going to have to hurry. And then they had them go out the door and walk right past a person who was lying, apparently unconscious, in the sidewalk, to the point at which they almost had to step over this person to get to the next building. And they wondered how many people would stop. So on average, 40 people stopped. But the most important thing of this lesson was that if you looked at the low hurry category, 63% of the people stopped. If you looked at the medium hurry category, 45% stopped. And if you look at the high hurry category, 10%. It seems kind of obvious in retrospect, but if you ask people, particularly psychologists, to predict what they think is going to be the outcome of this experiment, they get it terribly wrong. And the reason why is something called the fundamental attribution error, which is we tend to think we have a psychological mechanism inside all of us, which is to attribute to individuals inherent and persistent traits based on the behavior we see. If somebody runs a stop sign, rolls right through it, and we're on our bike, we think that person's a terrible person. We think, they are inconsiderate. They probably don't bike commute at all because they would have. We make all sorts of attributions based on that. We don't think their wife is in labor, or something's happened. They're in a terrible hurry, or who knows what else, what other conditions or context might create that situation. So what this experiment talks about is the fundamental attribution error that we all make. And what I want to talk about today is how, in fact, that plays out in innovation theories. And we have to be all collectively very careful not to fall prey to the fundamental attribution again in innovation theories. So just to give a working definition of how that would play out in innovation theories, we would make attributions based on particular attributes of an organization or of a new technology, and say that this innovation outcome that we observed is the product of a particular set of practices that an organization follows, or particular attributes of a technology. And therefore, all innovation by this organization will be this way, and all other organizations that want to be like that and be that successful should also follow these behaviors, because we have now decided that they predict a particular outcome. So we see it happen, for example, in ideas or technologies. The light bulb succeeded. Edison invented the light bulb. Edison came up with the light bulb, and it took over the market. Therefore, we make all sorts of attributions about Edison and about the light bulb and about the way the innovation process works. Never mind the fact that there were 40 years worth of light bulbs, incandescent bulbs, before Edison's, and all sorts of other associated context. It's a much easier attribution to give Edison the credit and to understand, try and understand what it was that he did differently. If we look at the automobile, there were, again, a number of automobiles before Ford's. There were even attempts at mass production before Ford's. We don't look at what was in the context. We simply look at Ford and Ford Motor Company and even the Model T to make attributions about why that event took place the way it did. And then all the way fast forward to the iPhone and Steve Jobs. And again, we're back to making individual and organizational attributions based on individual technology. Google is the best one, primarily for one particular reason, and I hate to pick on this guy. But for the media frenzy that was around trying to understand what it was about Google that made them so successful, and they have in many ways shaped innovation theory of the last 8 to 10 years, because we've started to look at what it was, 5-star cafeterias, 15% employee free time dedicated to pet projects, lots of launch and learn, lots of ideas thrown out there. And those all must, if Google was successful with those practices, then any company should now be successful with those practices, regardless of the industry, regardless of the situation. What would Google do was a book that was published and immediately applied to, well, GM's going under, how should we fix GM? And on and on and on. Where else this came out was, in fact, in the DOE and ARPA-E particularly, the funding of breakthrough projects using a notion of a sort of a venture capital investment model. This was a major investment by a large government agency based on the assumption that if it worked for venture capitalists funding internet entrepreneurs to revolutionize the internet and e-commerce, it must work to revolutionize energy. And you had billions of dollars thrown in, roughly $2 billion basically thrown into the venture capital model as a policy means to foster entrepreneurship in what is a very different sector and a very different situation than the ones that we've seen in venture capital working in. So what you had was Kleiner Perkins leading the way and also taking the brunt of it because most of their investments in clean tech then fell through. And a bunch of articles about why the clean tech investment boom went bust and why Kleiner Perkins was failing in so many of their funds. This is not an I told you so, but I did tell you so. Martin Kenny and I wrote a paper a couple years ago about why the venture capital model wouldn't work. And we looked at some sort of core structural reasons why venture capital works and how those didn't match the context of most clean tech. And that's, again, where a lot of these ideas started to come out of the need to study the context in which innovation is taking place in order to appreciate what behaviors, what aspects of policy will actually shape the outcome. And again, getting back away from that fundamental attribution error that we all make, that if it worked for venture capitalists in the entrepreneurial space and internet, then it must work in energy. So the big question that I wanted to talk about today was, do the same innovation practices and policies work everywhere? And obviously no, right? Nobody's going to come up and say, yes, they do. But you have to be very careful because innovation theory does not distinguish between contexts at all. Very few professors, and I probably am as guilty as anybody else, publish in their research, oh, but this is probably very specific to the organization I studied, or the particular market I studied, or the particular moment I studied that market. So one of the things that you need to do, and we all need to do, is be more cognizant of the context. Not just the particular market structure, but the moment in time when that structure was in place and what was changing about it there. So as I talked about with the electric light and Edison, I did some work on this. It was actually a really enjoyable study. But if you track it, the first really controlled electric power was in roughly 1807 with Volta and the battery. Once they figured out the battery, you no longer relied on friction, no longer relied on sort of atmospheric energy. You could actually create a steady supply of energy. So what was the first thing they did with it? They used it to shock people and Mesmer and everybody else. And then they also used it to make light, to heat things up until they glowed. Light bulbs were the first thing, really, that they did with batteries, both arc lighting and incandescent bulbs. And so electric lighting was not a new phenomenon when Edison came along. In fact, it was about 75 years in the making. Now, once they had electric lighting, they started to work on new ways of generating electricity, and they had, then they used. Actually, the second thing they did was the telegraph system. But over the 75 years, a lot was happening in the electric industry that enabled Edison to invent the light bulb. Primarily, it was the development of generators and consistent generators that could supply a consistent power of electricity. Generators took roughly 50 years to develop. By the 1870s, 8 to 10 years before Edison got his start, was when the real breakthroughs in generators started happening. They started to power circuits of arc lights used outdoor lighting. So Brooklyn Bridge was lit at night. Central Park was lit at night. County fairs were lit by arc lights run on a series of arc lights powered by a generator long before Edison got his start. In fact, he has a wonderful quote where he walked into somebody's shop and saw these entire circuits at work and came back and said, this has all been done. It's all together. It just hasn't been done with incandescent bulbs. And if I can do that, then the whole system will work. But that's not the story I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, in fact, when Edison started in 1882, and he started with his Pearl Street Station, in the next 10 years, most of the primary companies that would dominate the electric industry for the next 100 years were born. Siemens, General Electric, Westinghouse, Thomson Houston, which now is Alstom, all were born in that 10-year period. So if we look at that, what it starts to show us is, in terms of context, there is market structure, and there's also a market window, a moment in time when innovation is possible. And then these companies come to take over the market and dominate. And that's just one. So if you look at the automobile industry, there was about 40 years worth of automobiles before Henry Ford got started. And then there was a 10-year period where most of the car companies, Ford, Chevrolet, Chrysler, Buick, Cadillac, and ultimately GM as a roll-up of the others, were born. 1902 to roughly 1912 or 1913 was when all of these companies were born. Now I bring you back to some of the, I don't know how many of you remember this, but I sure did. Those of us who, yes. The internet was 30 years from the 1967 project funded by DARPA to where we are today. And in that time, there was a 10-year period from roughly 94 to 2004 where Amazon was born, eBay, Google, Salesforce, and Facebook, all of whom came to dominate. And I bring this up particularly, and there's a good example in here that we talked about at lunch, of Google, which is, it was wonderful to be Google, and we could make all sorts of attributions about what kind of a company they were. But if they were that exact same company 5 years earlier, they would have been Lycos, AltaVista, Ask Jeeves, or any number of other companies that didn't have advertisers trying to advertise online, that didn't have visitors coming online because nobody really went to the internet that early in 93. You didn't have companies paying for advertising. You didn't have many web pages up there in the first place. And you didn't want to be Google 5 years later, because then you would be Bing, who's trying to catch up in a world that's been built around Google and their omnipresence. So really there was a moment in time when this kind of innovation could happen. And if we look to Google to try and understand the personal attributes, the organizational attributes of that company, and we take away the context of the situation in which they were born, we're going to come away with some terribly incorrect attributions. So part of the challenge in both theory, sort of the theory of explanation of what happened in terms of technology transitions or what might happen in terms of new technology, biofuels or hydrogen economy, we need to be very cognizant of the context itself. And we can't simply pull these old examples off the shelf and look at, create adoption rate assumptions about how a technology is going to spread, or look to the practice of particular companies or particular analogs and say this is going to happen again until we make very clear the context of the situation. Otherwise we're again encouraging the Lycos and AltaVistas or the Bings and missing the Googles. So back to that question, do the same innovation practices and policies work everywhere? And the answer, obviously, for me is clearly no. Context matters. And what I want to actually do in this talk is encourage you to start thinking about, this is a very new field. People have not spent much time at all really trying to characterize the context in which innovation takes place. For the most part, that's because innovation, I think I said this earlier, resonated with Dan, innovation flows downhill. It will follow the path of least resistance. The reason we had the electric light was not because we were all sitting around thinking, we really need the electric light. The reason we had the internet was not because we were, government policy said we need the internet. In most of the sustainable innovation challenges that we face today, we're actually objective driven. We're picking the particular context in which we want things to happen, and that changes it because now all of a sudden we do have to pay attention to context. We can't simply try and understand why innovation took place, where it did. We have to figure out how it can take place in the places we would like it to. And that means we need to spend as much time trying to understand that context and whether innovation can take place there, and in what forms as we should, I should say. So let me then talk about that. The context for sustainable innovation is really what I've been trying to get my head around here, and so I'm presenting these as, I'm positing these as propositions, and very loose ones at that. But I do want to get a sense, I'm going to throw these out there for you to get a sense of how we might start to think about context. So how would you characterize it? In what ways might you say, this is a particular setting that has one or another context? For example, in sustainable innovation, one of the ways in which the context differs from other areas of innovation that get more attention is that it's resource constrained. What do I mean by that? The inputs that actually enable innovation or on which innovation take place are at best staying the same and at worst getting less, getting smaller. And so the next one, brownfield versus greenfield. A brownfield is an established industry, an established sector. A greenfield is a brand new one. Before the internet, there was really there wasn't much we did. The only thing the internet had to compete with was television, in terms of people going home and doing things. As far as business, I mean, it was a brand new area in which there were no entrenched competitors and particularly no regulations. Scale, reliability, and profitability is a particularly sensitive one. I'll go through each of these individually in more detail. Uncertainty as a context is a characteristic, and the breakthrough bias, the focus on breakthroughs in technology as a means for innovation. So let me talk about each of those individually, and also take this moment to say, if you guys have any questions or comments, jump right in. This is meant to be a discussion, but we can have it at the end or in the middle. Yeah. Oh, originally, absolutely. Originally, it was a government purchasing program. I mean, it was driven by DARPA because not even as a focal project, but sort of as an IT project. We've invested all this money in calculating nuclear fallout using these mainframes, but we bought Dan a mainframe at Stanford, and now we have a guy down at UCLA who needs his own mainframe to do this, a different set of calculations. I would rather have one mainframe and they could all tap into it. Yeah. So it was an IT project. But what really, but what ended up happening was all of the grad students that would hang out using the mainframes and that system started to play with it. And they started to create new ways of messaging each other or new things to do with it or new standards or formats for communicating between mainframes or between servers and clients. And it grew from there. So yes, DARPA bought the ability to connect mainframes to researchers. They did not buy eBay or Amazon or any of those other things. And I think, to the internet as we know it today was not that way. It flowed downhill from there to the point where it followed what we wanted. So, in thinking about resource constraints, so one of obviously the defining challenge of sustainability is an attempt to reduce the number of resources that go into it, but also there's something to think about in terms of innovation, which is most of the innovations that we have seen in the last 50 years have actually been driven by this enormous explosion in resources where there weren't any before. World War II was sort of the beginning of a global economy, particularly with the Marshall Plan and all the development work that happened there and in Latin America and in Asia. The last 50 years has been an explosion of low-cost labor. As more and more of the globe entered the labor force, it was an explosion in transportation. As the cost of moving goods around the world got less and less, the resources required to do that. And we can see, in fact, let's just give that the best example I think we can give, right, is Moore's Law. The very technology on which IT is based has really been based on a predictable expansion in the resources available to do the things we wanted to do. The number of transistors, the number of instructions per second, all of these things and the cost have all made the resources available to do information technology greater this year than last year and twice as good every 2 years. So that's a circumstance in which innovation is really just trying to keep up with this massive influx of new resources to do things. And when you think about sustainability, it's actually going in the opposite direction. It's attempting to get more miles out of fewer gallons of gas. It's attempting to reduce whatever the footprint is for the work for the same amount of work. And that presents a different challenge from an innovation perspective. You're not automatically coming in with something that can do more the next year. The brownfield versus greenfield is relatively straightforward again, but when innovation flows downhill, it tends to flow the path of least resistance, which is through greenfields. Brownfields are established markets with entrenched competitors, existing regulatory regimes, existing technology regimes, and efforts to change those have been notoriously less successful. So this is a comment that came out in the early 70s, but if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we fix the ghetto? It came out again, unfortunately, in the last couple of years with ARPA-E and Google and the energy moonshot, the Manhattan Project of Energy. We had all of these analogies, which actually were more analogies based on greenfields than on brownfields. And you start to realize that what we were looking at was the kind of change that happened when there was nothing there, and hoping to map that same success onto changing something that's not only there, but is deeply, has been there for a century or two, and is extremely difficult to change. And how do we characterize that context? So whether it's a policy research question or sort of a new technology development research question, how do you think about the type of market into which this is going? How would you characterize the brownfield nature of it or the greenfield nature of it in such a way that you would actually get better insight into whether this is going to take off or not? Yeah, and to build on, because you're being very generous, right? A lot of what we see and what ITS has done is looking at, it's very hard when you're a suburban environment, you're living in a suburban state, to all of a sudden expect mass transit. But these things are actually they're fascinating. They also run very deep. Some of the brownfield characteristics that make innovations in transportation difficult in the U.S. were formed in the 1830s and 40s when governments decided how they were going to approach the railroad. In Europe, they were approaching the railroad from a nationalist perspective. The values of the railroad were, in Germany, I need to be able to move my army across, it wasn't Germany at the time, it was Prussia and the Balkan states. I need to be able to unite what is currently a divided set of states. And the railroad was seen as national unity. In France, it was seen as a national. Again, I need to move my troops from defending against Spain to defending against Germany to defending against the English. And it was again part of a national economy. Where in the U.S. and in England, it was purely driven by economics, by business interests. I need to move my coal to port cities. I need to move goods from this canal to that port. And businesses drove it. And as a result, what you see is in Europe and the continent, there's the hub and it's the star system. Everything comes out of Paris and Berlin. All the railroads connect. And there's an acceptance of public subsidy for mass transportation. And in the U.S. and in the U.K., there is a public sort of unwillingness to subsidize mass transit because it was always intended to be run privately. And Amtrak and other the private companies sort of dominate the rail. What you see, and now fast forward 200 years or 150 years, and you're trying to undo some of those brownfield circumstances that were set in stone so long ago. And if you don't understand that context, then it becomes very difficult to, then you're dangerously at risk of looking at a Google model or looking at an Apple model or looking at the innovation du jour and trying to apply that to a circumstance in which it won't work. If you look again, the PCs, there was a very greenfield moment in the personal computer era between 75 and 85, after which the industry structure was essentially set. Application software was the same way, even enterprise software between 85 and 95, and then that model was effectively set. The internet is, again, effectively set from 95 to 2005. And so what we have then is these moments of greenfield, at which point a lot of the ideas are in flux and a lot of the companies are emerging, and then they settle in. What does that tell us about transportation? It's a brownfield. Is there an opportunity for a greenfield occurring in any place outside of that? Because that may be the place in which any of these new technologies will really need to have to start. These are all questions that come out of this, and I'd love to have And, of course, electricity we talked about. Scale, reliability, and profitability is another one. And one, again, I wish the DOE had focused on a little bit better. So the question here is, in terms of the different contexts, can innovations in a particular context achieve the requisite scale, reliability, and profitability to actually stick, to make a difference? Just to give you a bit, so I worked at IDEO Product Development for a while, and we played in the Palo Alto City League softball, and we had our T-shirts. It said IDEO on the front, and on the back it said, faster, better, cheaper, pick any two. Meaning, we were consultants, we did design work, and you could either get your design work faster and better, or faster and cheaper, or better and cheaper, but you couldn't have all three. And that's sort of a trade-off to be thinking about in this particular context, because there's a relationship between scale, reliability, or quality, and profitability. In the energy sector, the only way to be effective is, in fact, to reach an enormous scale, because energy is already about as large a scale industry as you can find. To do that, you have to also do that with reliability. And I'll give you a couple examples in a second. But scale and reliability without profitability doesn't last a company very long. So Solyndra is a wonderful example of a company that hadn't yet really determined its final design for the technology. But they were pushed by the venture capital model to get out quickly, to go public quickly, to succeed and grow fast. So they had to try and scale, and this is the unfortunate picture of Obama in the Solyndra factory that they had just paid for, while Solyndra was attempting to scale up to the size at which it would have a visible impact on solar power. But they hadn't really dialed in the technology yet, and they weren't making any money. In fact, they were losing money, and the more they built and the more they scaled, the more they lost money until they eventually folded. I was personally involved in this because I was involved with a company that had installed several Solyndra panels, and we knew before even they got their federal grant that they weren't delivering the results promised. But again, what's the model that was used? It was a venture capital model of thinking about investment in new technologies, accepting the trade-off when in fact you couldn't. Fisker, we all know about. Again, they're not a whole lot worse than Tesla was when they got their start. Tesla is now a 10-year-old company, having spent the first 5 years trying to get 1,000 cars out. A123 battery failed. Not because of bad technology in that case, not because of bad advanced battery chemistry, but because of a failed welder. The 150-year-old technology in the factory, it was miscalibrated and was part of what drove them under because they had an enormous recall of batteries that were miswelded. But I think it does a really nice job of illustrating this challenge. If you're a startup in the internet world and you get a few things wrong, Microsoft can still survive launching, Windows XP or any of these things and still getting a lot of things wrong, and we're still tolerant of them. But when it comes to energy or batteries or any of these large-scale, old-school technologies, we're not very tolerant of failure, and these companies can go under as a result. Suzlon Energy was one of the wind companies. They produced about 1,250 turbine blades and had to replace all of them based on cracks in the carbon fiber process. The cracks that were developing in their process. And again, they had contracts that would have easily put them into bankruptcy had they been exercised by the utilities that had bought the power. So there's a real challenge here of thinking about scale and profitability and reliability that plays out in particular industries and not in others. Let me step back for a second and say, take these as a list of suggestions, of examples of ways in which we might characterize a context. This next one is uncertainty. And it's an interesting, how can I say this? It's an aspect of innovation that few people realize, but is a central one, because what drives innovation isn't necessarily the first person to build something. It's the second and third and fourth people who come in afterwards and follow on with improvements. And it's the investors who back that second, third, and fourth company, and it's customers who jump on board based on their ability to see and view with certainty the things that are happening. What drives that subsequent behavior is a reduction in uncertainty about whether this is the right business model. So when you saw those 10-year explosions in the growth and emergence of companies that would then dominate, what you were really seeing was a response to the reduction in uncertainty. We know electricity is going to be big, but we don't know how. We don't know what business models are going to work. We don't know whether it's a profitable business as a utility. But once Edison came out and reduced the uncertainty around the utility model as a profitable venture, everybody else was able to then say, okay, now we're going to organize in this way. Once Henry Ford was able to say that the 4-cylinder internal combustion engine with a 4-wheel, once that model was proven, investors and other entrepreneurs dove right in. And we can go down the list. A lot of these windows of rapid growth were, in fact, driven by a reduction in uncertainty. What people think about when they see Moore's Law is this enormous rate of technological change. But in the industry, it's actually been a wonderful means of certainty. Because we were able to look and say, okay, this computer this year is going to be able to do this. But in 2 years, that computer is going to have twice the instructions per second. It's going to have twice the processing power. It's going to have probably twice the memory, the screen resolution. All of these things are very certain. And so we begin to design the next level of the next generation of innovation based on these technological certainties. Now you move over into energy or into agriculture or some of these more sustainable, these areas where we're really attempting to drive sustainability. And there's much less certainty about what innovation will do, and which innovations will do it. Now, not to single Dan out, but much of that uncertainty is driven by policy uncertainty. There isn't much policy uncertainty in the high-tech world because there isn't much policy there. It's starting to be, and now it's starting to become very interesting. But in the energy sector and in agriculture, most of that is driven by policy, and the big questions investment questions are particularly around whether policy will stick. Is this certain? Is this a certain environment? If I invest in wind, will the tax credits be driven away? That's been the last 20 years. If I invest in solar now, will the tax credits be driven away? Will the tariffs or all of these things? Now, these become great sources of uncertainty in a sector, and therefore inhibitions to investment. Again, one more element of the context of a particular situation that needs to be attended to in order to recognize why is nobody going into this space. So, a low-carbon fuel standard. It is, again, what I'm really trying to do is hopefully provoke some of you into thinking about this more deeply than I have. Because how would you measure uncertainty in a context? There's regulatory uncertainty, there's competitive uncertainty, or there's competitive certainty. There's technological uncertainty. How easily is it, for competing technologies to come in? Companies like certainty. And if they know that a dollar spent keeping policymakers stymied gives them certainty, they're going to spend it. But this is a challenge then for this becomes the context in which scientists and entrepreneurs are looking for investment dollars to develop new technologies further. It's the context in which companies are looking to invest millions or hundreds of millions in new pilot plants or not, and that uncertainty is a tremendous impact on the innovation process. The last one I wanted to talk about was the breakthrough bias, which is, again, it is an element of each different context. We tend to have particular places where consumers, investors, regulators, and others seem to be waiting for breakthroughs. I think this was, well, in fact, and the energy sector has been characterized that these same companies that are creating uncertainty are also creating it by saying, well, we're ready to go with hydrogen. You just tell us when. It could be here next year. So let's not worry so much about CAFE standards right now because, hydrogen's right around the corner. Or whatever else it is. There is that breakthrough, so let's not do anything let's not improve current coal plants right now because, Solar is going to knock those off the planet, and we won't have to worry about them anymore. And you have this sort of bias towards breakthroughs, which is changing the way people behave, and that therefore changing the way innovation is received. Much of that, of course, is also predicated on the recognition that most innovations that have an impact are not breakthrough. They're not new technologies. They're old technologies, particularly in fields where faster, better, cheaper is a requisite. They tend to be technologies that are 20, 30, 40 years old. The new clean diesel was a stationary diesel technology from the 60s and 70s. Even fracking is a 50, 60-year-old set of technologies, and that's one of the reasons why it could scale so quickly. And so what we have then is this bias in many industries towards breakthroughs. In fact, we were just talking at lunch about the pharmaceutical industry. There's a bias towards breakthroughs because there's an intellectual property policy regime that profits breakthroughs at the expense of off-label use of existing drugs, when in fact most drugs. So we have these different contexts in which breakthroughs tend to have a bias, or there tends to be a bias in policy or in the market towards them, making the use of existing technologies extremely difficult. A lot of this came from the endless frontier, the old Vannevar Bush science policy regime, which said most advances come from investments in science. But Václav Smil does a really nice job of talking, the historical verdict is unassailable. Because of the requisite technical and infrastructural imperatives, because of numerous and often entirely unforeseen socioeconomic adjustments, energy transitions in large economies on a global scale are inherently protracted affairs. We don't have breakthroughs that happen overnight and take an industry by storm for many of the reasons I laid out already in advance. You could say the same thing about his sentence structures. They're protracted affairs. But there's still an enormous amount of good content in them. But the thinking there is, how do we characterize the receptiveness of a particular context or a particular industry or sector for advances rather than for breakthroughs? All right, so what I've done there is talk about some of the particular dimensions of the context that I looked at and I saw as unique to sustainable, I wouldn't say unique, but particular to sustainable innovation. And some of the things that ended up doing for me was allowing me to see particular sets of skills or capabilities the companies had that made them good at what they did. And so then, in fact, let me see if I won't go into that in too much detail right now. But what I want to leave you with here is, how might we measure the context in which innovation takes place? If we're looking at biofuels, how might we measure the characteristics of that context so that we would know how to think about innovation in that field? If we're looking at car sharing, how might we measure the context? We had the conversation at lunch of car sharing is taking off in Europe. In many ways, that's because it was a brownfield established around mass transit that can actually more easily accommodate car sharing. It can accommodate car sharing more easily than it can accommodate individual car ownership, because there's just no parking and there's no garages. So you have these different contexts in which we can start to understand. And then how might we use such measures to guide both the science and technology development, the management of innovation, and then policies that are intended to foster innovation? So that's what I want to leave on a conversation basis. I'll just give you a quick example. So what I took from this perspective on context for my own work was a recognition that there were a set of capabilities that companies needed to be good at this that weren't in the existing innovation literature. The ability, Nexus work is an emerging recognition that a lot of what companies do in the innovation process is build new relationships where none existed before. It's actually particularly evident when you need to undo or compete against brownfield where there are strongly entrenched existing relationships. So you need to come up with your own sort of equivalent powerful network in order to make headway into an existing. Companies need to manage science and policy. And by this I mean the very science, the actual understanding of phenomena in ways that in large companies in the internet or in other spaces may not have to. A wonderful example of that was Johnson Controls' ability to, let's see, let me come back. Daimler's ability in driving clean diesel to actually engage with the with both the California Air Resources Board and the EPA to ensure that a new additive to a car could be accepted and in what ways it could be accepted in order to appease the mileage standards of those regulators. And those are skill sets that you don't see discussed in innovation, the ability to actually manipulate policy or to manipulate science. Manipulating science, another great one is the start-stop battery. And the need to change the drive cycle that's used to test the mileage of cars in order to make sure that the requisite amount of idling time matched what consumers actually did with cars rather than what the old test was in order to get credit for a start-stop battery. So these are capabilities that you can start to see in companies that are critical that you wouldn't see if you didn't appreciate the different particular context in which it has to happen. Recombinant innovation, robust, we can talk about all these things offline. But again, it's a point to say that you can see new insights if you're willing to look at the different contexts and what makes a particular innovation challenging in a particular context. So I'll come back to these questions, and hopefully there's some thoughts behind how this might be used or how this might be fixed. Yeah. Well, I mean, O-Power is a good example of that. O-Power. No, but it's fascinating because if you saw SMUD's reaction when they went with O-Power, frowny faces or little bad comparisons generated 2 or 3 times the number of customer complaints. I think they got 15 complaints one month when it first came out. It wasn't like thousands of complaints, but it was 15. And when you're a public utility, measured on reliability and customer service by the Utility Commission. Well, in this case, it was their local one. They were that meant a lot, and they had an automatic sort of visceral flinch because they did change behavior. They did nudge, and they got some pushback, and it wasn't much, but it was enough for them to have a hard time with. But it gets at yes, there are a lot of behavioral changes that we can do that don't fit the breakthrough bias mold, but they need to be they need to be done well, and people need to be prepared for it. But I
say this whole theoretical framework would apply to breakthroughs in behavior the same way it would apply to breakthroughs in lighting technology?
absolutely. I do in the sense, but for a couple of reasons. Partly because the framework I'm trying to get out there is that we need to think about the particular context. And in some contexts, behavioral changes may be the only changes we have available. And therefore, we should be thinking about the best ways to do them. But the other point I should make is that one of the aspects of the breakthrough bias that doesn't take into account is that behavioral change is, you can't have technological change without behavioral change. So part of the challenge may actually be, and in fact, I talk about this in robust design, that the need to actually change behavior. The limiting factor for technological change isn't the technological change, it's the behavioral change and how fast people can adopt and adapt new technologies. So, one of the reasons the iPhone took off, I was just actually writing a case about this, was because in many ways we were already primed. We were primed for the iPod by the Walkman. Then the iPod and the pager primed us for BlackBerry and the Palm Treo, and then those primed us for the iPhone, so that there was a sort of a built-in market with a with of customers who were learning how to use these new mobile technologies. So by the time that came out, it wasn't really all of that new. And we had made behavioral changes in the process. And you find the same situation with electric lighting and other things. It's a number. It's fragmenting, but it's a fun question to think about. Priming, what it's priming is sort of ubiquitous cloud stuff. Martin Kenny and Brian Pond, I don't know if you they're doing some good work on that. The platforms that are emerging next have less to do with that hardware and more to do with our constant connectivity and how we expect our data to be everywhere at all times and available to us. But if you're looking for predictions into where that'll go in technology and but what the VCs learned with clean tech is their limits. So what they would like to see was, where's that going in a way that can get there with three guys in a computer using the Amazon. I don't want to get into anywhere where I have to invest in steel and concrete. It may still flow the path of least resistance. They didn't invest, so they didn't make their money. But yeah, there's a couple things there. One of which is you're making the assumption then that the DOE's investment in Fisker and Coda and Tesla was what drove the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf. That, in other words, those wouldn't have happened had the government not invested in Tesla. I think one of the things that we're forgetting is the Prius, the Insight, and the role that large companies played. I mean, I think Tesla has now sold about 20,000 cars or so. It's last year, which was their first year, right? Well, no, their first year of the S. right? And then they add another 1,000 cars. You know how many cars DeLorean sold in his first year? 5,000. So it's on a scale, I would not say that Tesla has moved the needle. They've done very well from a public relations perspective. From an internet bubble perspective, they've also done very well. They're trading at 10 times revenue when most car companies trade at 3/4 their annual revenue. Their market cap is 3/4 annual revenue. So they're an anomaly that I wouldn't say we want to sort of replicate. But I'm also not sure that Tesla has necessarily driven Leaf and Volt sales. Or in fact, I think that's playing on the actual change, the priming behavior of the Prius and the Insight, which is we get these people who now are hypermilers. They're looking at their battery use and trying to. They wish they could have these, plug-in hybrids, and then I wouldn't say that the electric vehicle has necessarily solidified its position in the market, and B, I think what market there is as much due to the hybrid and its introduction of electric technologies. So that's where, now the other thing is to think about the alternative policy perspectives. By investing in these breakthroughs, we're not investing in other policy tools that might have a greater effect. Yeah, right. No, that's a great point. It's like if you take it to the extreme, a contextual approach to innovation is really just historians telling you what happened. Plato said, historians tell you what happened, poets tell you what happens. Poets and professors, right? So we're supposed to develop some sort of a theory that predicts how things happen. But to the extent in the innovation process we become so generalizable as to apply to all contexts, we've lost, I think, an enormous amount of relevance. We cannot tell you what happens in all situations based on a few single. But I think I'm arguing for somewhere in the middle. Now, the one thing I will say in my defense is the context. Taking into account context is not the end. I personally find that the end is once you recognize the particular context, you see the particular challenges that situation requires. And then there's a limited set of sort of capabilities or requirements that are available in a particular in a market in which there's enormous regulatory uncertainty. What are the policy implications of that? What are the organizational implications for managing innovation in that situation? In a case where there is a particularly brownfield situation, there will be some behaviors or capabilities that are simply not required and some that are required. And we need to be more cognizant of what those are. So it's more of a sort of an intermediate step towards. No, you will always find, and any theory has a challenge at the edges. In a particular case like this, though, I think you can argue that there was greenfield territory online for online commerce, and Amazon took that. They didn't take out Walmart shoppers, but they took people who were going online to buy things, and they were the only game in town. And so there are ways in which I think greenfield and brownfield do present themselves more cleanly. I mean, there are other circumstances. I don't think it requires a retrospection to be able to determine a lot of these. If they do, then these are not valuable constructs. But I think you should be able to find some agreement on the level of regulatory certainty in a particular sector, the level of, is this a brownfield or a greenfield? I mean, not to get down into the weeds on that one, but, how many different layers of supply chain are there? How many different, how many different competitors are there? How long have these dominant technologies been in place? How well established are the behavioral patterns of consumers? I think it's safe to say you could make a fairly strong claim as to if I gave you a set of rules for that and then we took it to 50 undergraduates, they would probably be able to come to some pretty close agreement. If you're saying you could make both arguments, you could. But I think I would have a hard time believing that rooftop solar is a greenfield market. What you're providing is energy. So what you're competing against is the homeowners' other sources for energy, and the other providers of energy. And as soon as rooftop solar gets, as we're seeing, the utilities are now starting to say, hey, wait a minute. You're forgetting all of the power lines that we're maintaining. You're forgetting all of the service trucks and all of these other things that we're having to pay for. So you're starting to get pushback from the incumbents who are deeply involved in this sector. So you're seeing resistance which would suggest there is, in fact, a brownfield there. Yeah, the Ubers, the X. Yeah. Right. We talked a lot. I would describe this as another brownfield situation. And the reason I would describe it that way is because the Utility Commission has gotten itself involved already, laying claim to this as a sector that they already regulate. So right there we have, if the Utility Commission claims it regulates this space, it's a brownfield. But beyond that, you're getting the taxi companies and the limo companies starting to, again, lobby because these are activities, these are traditional activities of these companies and regulated for particular reasons. These services that are provided are in many ways indistinguishable from taxis and limos. So how are they not a brownfield? Good. Not a whole lot different from a dispatch service that most taxis use. I mean, taxi companies are constantly dispatching. Here's a call at this place. Then you have the priority and then and a time window to take that call, or it gets passed to the next person. I mean, it's a disaggregation of it to sort of contract workers, but that's partly why that industry was regulated in the first place. No, I'm going to defend. I'm going to end up defending the strategic management a little bit more than that.
Okay,
Well, no, so one of the things I'm actually dancing around is a structure agency dualism that is a duality, which is part of the conversation in management and sociology particularly. What I'm saying is that the structure matters. The industry structure, the current context of the industry matters. It's not simply the agency of a Google or a Steve Jobs who can then change the world. They're changing the world from a particular place and from a particular set of tools that the world provided him with. The question of strategic management, it does dance on the edge of irrelevance because it's, to the extent that it's convincing MBAs that they can do, that there is no historical context. So whatever strategy you decide at this moment is going to be the same one that would work 10 years from now. Yeah. But there is an enormous amount of agency for the Edisons and the Jobs and others who see before anybody else that now is the time for this change to happen. And these are the pieces that need to come together. So there's a lot of agency, but it's an agency built on the ability to recognize those elements of the structure that are now possible to manipulate. Yeah, people have things to do. Absolutely. Thanks very much for the time. So. Well, I don't know how to turn this off, but it's.
Oh, yeah, that would be good.
This corner?
Yeah, I only have a
I do too, but,
but I mean,
it's at 12.
It would be. That would be good, wouldn't it?
I still feel like it was different in the 90s.
I've had a couple of those come by. But the other, and they go to